So yeah, I'm very lucky to be joined here today by Gabriella Coleman, a cultural anthropologist who holds the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at McGill University. You're probably most well known, I guess, for commenting on sort of being the go-to person for Anonymous, and you're currently touring, I guess, with the launch of your new book, Hacker, Hoaxer, Whilstleblower, Spy: The Many Faces of Anonymous. You launched that on Guy Fawkes Day here.
I did. Well, the launch actually was the day before in London.
Right, yeah.
But it's quite nice because in some ways I never understood why they didn't launch it on Guy Fawkes Day. But because they launched it a few days before, actually people were able to get the book by Guy Fawkes Day. So perhaps that was the reason why they did it a few days before.
The book itself kind of explores a fairly popular and well-known and visible icon, which is the Mask of Anonymous. However, it's a deeply rich and nuanced walk through that development of, I guess, what was kind of seen as a very closed-off kind of culture into something that was much more public and much more political. But kind of going back to the start, how did you actually get into that in the first place, like from a cultural anthropological perspective, I guess?
So I often like to say that Anonymous was an accident because they were known to be fearsome pranksters. They were into internet trolling. And I myself also got to Anonymous quite accidentally. Yeah. And basically what happened was during the course of my first research project on open source, I met a number of people who had protested the Church of Scientology during the 1990s when critics of the church first started to circulate secret church documents, and geeks and hackers got involved when issues of copyright and trademark and anonymity came into the play when people protested the Church of Scientology. Yeah. But I never knew what to do with this material that I came across, and it wasn't until I ended up at the University of Alberta in 2006 and 7 where I started to engage in this material because the university houses the largest Scientology archives in the world. And I figured, well, someone was sending me a sign, I might as well dive into this. And so I started developing a project on this history that covered geek battles against the Church of Scientology. But I was secretive about the project. I was concerned that Scientology would perhaps sue me because they would go after journalists and academics. So it was my stealthy, super secret side project until 2008 when something by the name of Anonymous, who I was unfamiliar with prior to 2008, came into being to basically prank the heck out of the Church of Scientology. And the reason why they wanted to prank them was because a video of Tom Cruise had been released, and it was a Scientology video. And it was leaked to the internet, and the Church of Scientology was going to sue publishers who didn't take it down. So due to that event, Anonymous pranked the Church of Scientology by sending them pizzas and pranking the Dianetics hotline. And I figured I might as well follow this because here was another kind of horde of geeks attacking the church again. So it just felt like a natural progression to that first historical project.
To people unfamiliar with that video, it's Tom Cruise kind of saying pretty much that stuff like, if you pass by in a car accident, only people who are members of the church know what to do and stuff like this. Like it seems like it was a really bizarre kind of mythical space itself. Was that part of the attraction, you think, in terms of Anonymous's kind of response?
Yeah, the video was ridiculous. It was hilarious. And it was also just a window into the narcissistic culture and world that is Scientology. It's like pure narcissism. Like, why would it be that only Scientologists could help someone, if they were in an accident? And so people love watching the video because it just struck a kind of ridiculous chord. And then it struck even more ridiculous that the church is trying to stop the circulation of the video on top of it, right? But again, when Anonymous first kind of got involved, they did so for the fun of it, for what they call the lulz, L-U-L-Z, a kind of bastardization, pluralization of laugh out loud. They were just doing it to kind of be mischievous and have a good time. And everyone, myself included, thought that they would troll the heck out of the Church of Scientology and then recede into the background. But in fact, that's not what happened.
And that kind of seed of a culture of kind of like trolling and pranking, but what you explored in the book is, I guess, more historical spaces where those kind of characters come out and play a role in the sort of illuminating the sort of cultural fabric of society as such.
So exactly, Anonymous came out of this world of trolling, but trolling is not unique to Anonymous, right? Trolling preceded Anonymous, both offline and online, and I provide a bit of a genealogy of online trolling prior to Anonymous or contemporary to Anonymous. And so Anonymous is interesting because of the way that they blanket their pranking in anonymity, but in fact, some trolls really like to be public about what they do. And so one of the characters I explore is this hacker troll called Weave, W-E-E-V, and he's quite famous, perhaps, you know.
Fairly contentious figure, right?
Very contentious figure because, you know, some forms of trolling people can get behind because it's clear that it's impelled by irony. And in the case of Weave, he really embraces pure extremity and offensiveness to the extent that his kind of very racist speeches, for example, you know, a lot of people who kind of can get behind trolling can't get behind, you know, his actions. But he identifies as a troll. He used to be the president of a group offensively named Gay Niggers Association of America, right? And that's the thing about trolling. It really is a really complicated set of activities that on the one hand isn't necessarily racist or misogynistic, but in other instances it absolutely is, right?
Yeah. There's a slight weirdness to the certainly with the way the Weave talks now is very explicitly racist. There was a sense that I even looked at myself in terms of trying to make sense of stuff where some kind of behaviours and ways of talking seemed to be a parody, and I saw some types of explanation that sought to diffuse the sort of political nature of the you know, of racist talk or hate speech itself, and say that actually because it was happening within the culture that it was happening in, it didn't have the same expression, it didn't have the same weight perhaps if you used it face to face. How do you tease that out, or is there any sense to that at all? Or?
Yeah, it's tough. I think I'm really, really conflicted about the language. So, first of all, like, let's just say a troll or an asshole on the internet targets an individual and names them by name and calls for violence against them. I don't care if it's trolling or not or what it is. It's just like pure harassment, and you know, that person, you know, should be stopped, right? Yeah. I think the more ethically complicated arena is when no individual is being targeted, but there's racist language being used, right?
Yeah.
That's actually both protected by free speech in the United States, and a lot of trolls also, you know, feel like this is part of what they do and for different reasons. So let me just give you a really good example. In the anonymous community, many of them, you know, use the epithet fag for everything.
Yeah.
You know, you could be a new fag, old fag, moral fag, political fag, right? And part of the interesting politics is to take away the bite from that word by calling everyone a fag, right? Yeah. And that kind of rings true. Like, there's that possibility there, right? And on top of it, within Anonymous in particular, there's a lot of like queer anons, right? So that can strike a kind of politically progressive chord. However, if you're an outsider and don't know the kind of rules of engagement going on, it could be extremely offensive.
That's what it seems like.
You know?
Yeah.
And so this is, again, a kind of extremely complicated terrain. And I will also say, on top of the fact that they are trying to devitalize the word so that it doesn't have these negative associations anymore, and it's kind of an equal opportunity word. Everyone is called this, right? It's not really just for the jerks or the marginalized, right? On the other hand, there is a bit of a kind of naive language ideology embraced by a lot of not all, but a lot of geeks and hackers, where they believe that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never, hurt me.
Yeah.
That they're devoid of, piercing political power. And we know that's not the case, right?
For sure, certainly, like from our own, from my own kind of research and looking at like what I do, I guess, in the day-to-day job, there is a direct correlation between, violent language and, for example, physical violence on the streets in terms of racism. Pretty much all the data we have suggests that there's never a sort of physical attack without violent language.
Right.
Now, obviously, the relationship there is much more complex than just saying it's a direct relationship, but then within that space we have this kind of what can seem very confrontational kind of discourse and languages. At the root of it all, there seems to be a sense of collectivity, and sort of how do those two things kind of sit together?
No, it's one of the most interesting things about the two different eras of Anonymous, and by the two different eras or the two different faces, I'm talking about the activist face and the trolling face.
Yeah.
And sometimes they bleed into each other, although I do think actually you can separate them pretty explicitly. But one of the interesting things that they share, and all the different political nodes in Anonymous share, because there's these different nodes that are kind of at war with each other, is that you never do what you do for individual fame, recognition, status, or reputation. You do it for the kind of collective, for the team.
Yeah.
And it's really frowned upon quite severely if you do violate that rule, right? And this is quite interesting because this runs against the kind of grain of dominant cultural ideals of celebrity, individuality, and recognition in kind of very profound ways. And when Anonymous simply existed as a trolling name that was used primarily on an image board by the name of 4chan, the name Anonymous came into being because all the posts in this message board were posted by Anonymous.
Yeah.
You didn't even have pseudo-anonymous nicknames. People really didn't accrue status or reputation.
Yeah.
And it was in this milieu where you had this ethic really form in a very profound way. The activist nodes tend to develop, the participants tend to develop stable identities and personalities. So they do accrue reputations and status, right? But you're never supposed to convert that internal status into external status.
Yeah, there's a confluence there though where you have that culture, for example, that's developed kind of online on 4chan, where it's like the ego is kind of removed in some senses, but then there's a slight overlap where you have a political perspective that seeks to, for example, reject the sort of culture of celebrityism. That's a political viewpoint. I'm kind of wondering, was there a kind of confluence there, a kind of happy marriage perhaps, that allowed the sort of political ideologies, whether that's sort of libertarianism or communism or anti-capitalism, and sort of something much more explicitly political as activisms, and then that pre-existing culture, that culture that developed of anonymity as well.
Absolutely. I think that there is a kind of symbiosis and confluence between what was a kind of cultural milieu and commitment, which had pockets of explicit political recognition. Because even on 4chan, people did rail against the culture of celebrity.
Yeah.
But again, it happened in a way that was very ephemeral. Whereas in the activist wings, because they had to enforce this ideal, because it was much harder to enforce, right? Because you had stable identities, because people did accrue reputations. It became a living ethic. In that way, it's far more politicized. It's far more, people are far more reflexive about it. It's far more powerful because it's just not imposed by a technical default of a technical infrastructure, but it has to be negotiated through social practice in a lot of ways. And there's failures all along. One of the things I track in the book are individuals who decide to either show up with their name, they were never anonymous, or they reveal who they are, and then I kind of show them get skewered and chastised and drugged and marginalized, right? Yeah. And this is precisely the kind of activity that couldn't even really happen on the message board 4chan, because again there was a default anonymity. So in the context of these activist wings, it had to be enacted in practice, and I think this is a far more like interesting way in which the collectivity and the collective ideal has to exist.
Yeah, it's very clear. Talking to you before, previously, but obviously through the book, you're quite sympathetic and empathetic with the sort of activist wings, I guess, within the anonymous movements. Where would you kind of situate yourself politically? Is your own kind of politics kind of informed, or have you been informed by sort of engagements with anonymous? Like,
right.
what's that kind of relationship?
So, I definitely don't come out of a kind of troll or hacker milieu, but probably there's a couple of my own political sensibilities that have, first of all, just been changed because of anonymous or working with hackers over the years. And then there's certain alignments and then certain differences, right? And so I think over the years, I've become much more of a free speech fundamentalist in a lot of ways. And while, again, I do think that words can hurt, that they're not just empty shells or empty signifiers, I am so concerned about censorship. I would rather have less kind of regulation of hate speech, let's just say, across the internet, because I think that there's real disastrous effects that can happen when you afford governments the power to censor, right?
Yeah.
That said, if you're a small activist community on a mailing list, on some sort of website, I totally believe in regulating norms there and speech, right?
Yeah.
Like, collectives have to have the right to be able to regulate the rules and norms of their own community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying like people should all be free speech extremists.
Yeah.
That said, I don't want the government outlawing all instances of kind of hate speech. That makes me uncomfortable. And that, I think, I was definitely been influenced by, hackers and geeks and civil libertarians. So that's something where I've perhaps, become more sympathetic to that over time. I also really believe that it's good to practice transgressive and subversive behavior and rule breaking, and I think it's really hard activity to do. Again, why I like Anonymous as a kind of activist force is because it's a space that really embraces the spirit of rule breaking.
Well, that spirit that's kind of embodied, I guess, in the nature of trolling initially itself, definitely took on a very different form. What was it, do you think, like, certainly, I know, for example, for myself, my first real sense that there's something strange going on with Anonymous, I wasn't even aware of 4chan at the time, but I was watching via Twitter what was happening in Tunisia, and I found it really quite mad. It was quite clear there's an international solidarity network. There's something going on here, which I wasn't able to get my head around, but it was in plain sight in some senses. What was going on there at that time?
So one of the interesting things, and we can link this up to transgression and subversion, and again, why I think Anonymous should be considered kind of activist, and also the whole entity teaches us lessons about when transgression is a kind of positive force, and then when it also spirals out of control. Yeah. And so, for example, I'll back up a little bit. One of the things I do in the book is I compare Anonymous to tricksters. And the reason why I like to do this is not simply to celebrate Anonymous. A lot of people think I use the trickster simply to kind of celebrate them.
Yeah.
And if we actually return to the trickster myth, what we see is that certain tricksters, like Loki is a great example. He is a trickster who just follows no rules. He follows his own appetite. He's kind of a jerk. He is kind of transgression, subversion, and rule breaking out of control. It's not contained, right?
Yeah.
And as a result, he provides a really good lessons of what happens when you have subversion, when it's not hitched, when it's not connected to something else.
Yeah.
And I sometimes think some of the darkest sides of trolling is precisely when it's sort of extreme subversion for its own sake, with no sort of sense of the effects of trolling. What I like about Anonymous when they became activists is that they still kind of embraced subversion, but it tended to then be connected or hitched to political causes and activist causes, right? So the transgression is a bit contained, right? And there's certain operations, like when they got involved in the Arab Spring, where trolling or humorous type tactics didn't really have that much of a place or never came into being, and it was like pure solidarity, fighting corruption, getting the protest videos out of Tunisia, hacking into the Tunisian government, right? But there was other political kind of operations where trolling or humor did enter, but again, it was subservient to the kind of political operation as opposed to done for its own sake.
I would imagine, that to sort of engage and move from a space of selling pizzas to a church, for example, and kind of going, we're going to have a pop at a government, at a state here, at a nation state, in solidarity with uprisings that were happening there. That's a pretty big step. And I think it's that kind of step, perhaps, as you explore in the book, brought Anonymous to attention not just to a wider public and perhaps activist spheres and political spheres that he mightn't have already been visible to, but also to nation states themselves. And you had, I guess around a similar time, we had WikiLeaks on other types of expressions that really were challenging the legitimacy of nation states and how they use power and how they use information. But you explore that a little bit in terms of what that meant for Anonymous in terms of
So first of all, absolutely, the stakes in the game had really changed, right? When all of a sudden Anonymous, first of all, rose up in defense of WikiLeaks, which they had done in December, and then they started to soon after target governments, right? And even they themselves were like, this is a big step. And after kind of a first stab at, or first proposal at targeting Tunisia when protests started rumbling there, they backed away. And then it was only during kind of the second proposal that they sort of moved there. But I think that this is absolutely the point where, government, law enforcement realizes this, is not going to go away, right? You have this name and these activists assembling around the name to engage in a really impressive array of collective action, and they're willing to kind of push the envelope using digital direct action, whether it's computer hacking into governments or distributed denial of service attacks, which is when you overwhelm the server with too many requests. Here is a kind of youthful movement willing to embrace digital direct action in very different parts of the world against governments and corporations. Well, they're not going to sit back, right? They're going to absolutely take action and really try to stamp it out in a lot of ways, and stamp it out precisely because it's starting to be seen as political. This is why I think it's most threatening, not because it's just chaotic hellraisers, right? But precisely because it's going to appeal to the sorts of people who want to see social justice and change. And so, right in January, you have a bunch of warrants issued in the United States against 40 participants who had engaged in supporting WikiLeaks through these distributed denial of service attacks. And you start to see some arrests in the UK, and then by the following summer, you start to have even more crackdowns against Anonymous.
In trying to, clearly, certainly we talked a little bit in terms of the different types of responses by states, certainly the difference between the US and the UK and both in Ireland, I guess, for the two lads that were lifted here. But kind of going back a bit, even at the time, I was really excited by Anonymous, right? No, I still wasn't sure what the political weight of it was, but it was kind of happening within a context where you were having uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, parts of the Middle East, but also in, I guess what calls the English-speaking West as well. You've had 5 or 6 years of austerity. You've had a financial collapse. You have Occupy Wall Street, and the indignades in Spain. You have lots of manifestations of social discontent, and this seemed to be this phenomenon then arose within this kind of social context. And even in some ways, you kind of go, okay, I'm not really sure what it means to take down a website. But the fact that the sort of ballsiness of the message, first of all, which was and explicitly, fuck you, we're going to have you, combined within a context where there was all these kind of manifestations in the street. And these nodes of Anonymous seem to be operating everywhere. Right? To what extent do you think, is it that states were perhaps, the media played a role in overinflating the actual weight of this, but also that nation states or governments or corporations were scared and not really clear about what was going on or what this really was?
So, first of all, I think that's really nice that you sort of, pinpoint that Anonymous is existing in a milieu where there's all these kind of uprisings, right? And what's cool about Anonymous is that they're showing up in all of them, right?
Yeah.
So there's only Occupy, but Anonymous is there. There's only the Arab Spring, but Anonymous is there. And then they generate their own operations, right?
Yeah.
So they're kind of meta in a lot of ways. And it's precisely because they're anonymous, right? And they don't have a political ideology that they can show up in all these places. Like if they had a really specified manifesto, right?
Yeah.
Then they couldn't be so dynamic and flexible.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, like their circulatory power is what makes them threatening to states, right? That's part of it. It's sort of like, oh my gosh, it's a hydra that we cut off a head and then they still pop up elsewhere. Occupy was much easier to dismantle. There's a kind of coordinated day in the United States where a bunch of the camps were, broken up. You can't do that with Anonymous because they're not in a physical space, right? The way that the Occupy camps were.
Yeah.
And so that's part of their threat. It's like they're everywhere, but they're nowhere, right?
Yeah.
Another element does have to do, though, with the fact that they were just attracting a lot of attention, and the media was certainly amplifying them, a tremendous amount.
Yeah.
And had they not done that, Anonymous would not have become who they are, right? And in fact, today we have very big operations going on in Latin America, for example, and people tell me Anonymous doesn't exist. I'm like, whoa, these Peruvian lulsec hackers are, hacking away and doing really interesting things. We just don't see it because the media is not covering it in the way that they had done, here in Europe and North America. But I think especially the hackers in Anonymous, because Anonymous can't be reduced to hacking either in terms of the operations or the participants.
Yeah.
But the hacking, nevertheless, is a huge challenge to states.
Okay, yeah.
Because here are these people who can coordinate with a few other people and enter into corporations and governments and siphon off politically sensitive data that points to malfeasance and corruption. Holy shit. That's a big deal.
No,
that
totally.
is a big deal. And Anonymous erected that as a platform, an ideal, a tactic, a way of political being. And they made it seem like sexy and awesome.
Well,
you know what I mean? And that is extremely threatening, I think, in a true way.
Yeah.
So
it's deeply romantic in a way.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the Robin Hood, except at a very different level, right?
Exactly.
It gets to speak to a lot of people very quickly.
Right.
One of the things, and also in some of that, there's the lulls as well. So the H.B. Gary hack was like kind of arrogant security tech guy.
A security researcher who worked for H.B. Gary Federal and kind of hacker type himself, who claimed he had infiltrated Anonymous.
Yeah.
And he came up with a list of names and first of all spoke to a Financial Times reporter and kind of boasted that he was going to go public with the names at a conference and was going to go to law enforcement. And Anonymous reads this article that was published about H.B. Gary, the company, and Aaron Barr, its CEO.
Yeah.
And they see that the names are mostly wrong, actually. Not only are they mostly wrong, like the names of the hackers were not on the list, which was brilliantly funny because these hackers were also on the public channels and they were very well-known figures, Like I had been spending, the last couple of months with them and I certainly knew who Sabu and Tiflo were and they were not even included on the list, right?
Yeah.
So Anonymous decides that they must take immediate action against H.B. Gary and Aaron Barr and kind of teach him a lesson that you don't kind of mess around with Anonymous.
Yeah.
And they also decide to kind of very publicly release the names and also say that they're incorrect, right? And in the course of one evening, they infiltrate HB Gary Federal and download 70,000 emails. They post them on the Pirate Bay. They take over Aaron Barr's Twitter account. They wipe his iPad and iPhone.
Yeah.
And they also delete a lot of files in the company,
Yeah.
right? And so they basically engage in revenge hacking, and they do it, for the lulz. They think it's really funny, and it's a little bit of an exception to what they were doing. Right?
Yeah.
They were working in the Arab Spring, but
Totally,
they were
yeah.
protecting their own, right? Yeah. And it was also really pivotal because it really, first of all, just demonstrated what they can do. And then the interesting thing, too, is that they found some pretty politically damning information in the emails.
That subsequently then changed things a little bit as well. Is that, would I be right in saying that's where Lulzsec itself kind of came out of as a response to what was going on?
Yeah, so they found these emails that contained a PowerPoint presentation, which was a proposal that HB Gary Federal was working with in conjunction with Barrico and Palantir, two other companies, and they were pitching this to Bank of America, and basically it was a proposal to discredit WikiLeaks and the journalists like Glenn Greenwald who supported WikiLeaks.
Yeah. And
this was by smearing both of them. In the case of WikiLeaks, they proposed DDoSing WikiLeaks, proposed submitting false information to WikiLeaks to discredit them. And so here were these companies basically proposing to use highly illegal methods to discredit WikiLeaks and its supporters in order to land lucrative corporate contracts, right?
Yeah.
And I think this planted a seed in the anonymous hackers that they should, basically both try to expose security companies and their poor security, and also seek information.
Mm-hmm.
And Lulzsec, which was a breakaway group, didn't form in the immediate aftermath. Mm-hmm. It was still a couple months, but nevertheless, it set the stage for these breakaway hacker groups that really became prominent and anonymous later.
There's something even around that time as well that the activists in that milieu were pretty good publicists, and they had clearly built kind of useful relationships with some journalists who actually seemed to have a handle on what was going on, both in terms of the activities themselves, but the political import of perhaps what they were talking about, the relationships between private security firms and nation states themselves, sort of political manoeuvres and backroom deals, and potential proposed actions they could take against other actors. Do you think Anonymous could have acted the way that it was, or would be what it was, without actually both the, obviously the technical skills, but that back end of stuff that was...
Yeah, the media savviness was really important, and it was important through a couple of different channels. First of all, they make a lot of propaganda material in the form of like videos and art, and it gives just a visual face to what's hard to explain, and if you're going to be faceless, if you're not going to have prominent people, you better as well have pretty darn interesting images and videos, right? Because in our kind of celebrity saturated society, you need some spectacle. So if it can't be a celebrity leader, it has to be really provocative kind of art, and that's one of the things Anonymous did. Also, they had really good media makers and real good kind of in-house journalists, or people who understood journalism really well. Yeah. And one really important figure was Barrett Brown, who is a very talented satirical writer who had very good relationships with journalists in places like The Guardian and Rolling Stone. And he taught a lot of people about how to get media attention and how to land stories. He was really good at writing these stories and getting them published. Yeah. And so he became really kind of a pivotal actor in Anonymous who helped sort of link the world of mainstream or boutique journalism and Anonymous quite well.
Just, I guess, to look at perhaps sort of the actual repercussions, just as we mentioned, Barrett Brown, there seems to be a lot of political prisoners, from this movement. However, and how much do you think there's a level of, obviously within that network, a level of solidarity that there should be, but in terms of a wider kind of milieu, wider political activists. I'm not so sure how people actually recognise or speak to the fact that these folks, are political prisoners. They're prisoners from, political actions and movements themselves.
Yeah, so I use a phrase that I got from a National Lawyers Guild lawyer, Grania O'Neill, which is the nerd scare, and she's riffing off the kind of Red Scare.
Yeah.
Where in this case, there's a lot of geeks and hackers who've been, swooped up and jailed, and in the case of the United States, jailed for a very long time. And you have the case of Jeremy Hammond, who's now in jail for 10 years. He did hack the heck out of an intelligence firm.
Yeah.
The most shocking case is that of Barrett Brown, because he was jailed after threatening an FBI officer in a video, which is a kind of offense, big criminal offense. And that's kind of unsurprising. He got picked up for that, but he was also charged for sharing a URL, a link that linked to kind of stolen credit card material. But he didn't steal the credit card material.
So it's just the link itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And many of us shared that link, right? And he's been in jail now for 2 years. And there's been a kind of plea bargain.
Yeah.
And so things are being kind of sorted right now, but it's just kind of shocking that he even spent 2 years in jail. I think there's been actually really tremendous solidarity work around a lot of these prisoners. There have been certain individuals like Kevin Gallagher, who is behind the Free Barrett Brown campaign, who really publicized this case. There's a very talented woman, I don't know if she wants to be named, but she's very important, who runs the Free Jeremy Hammond campaign.
Yeah.
And these are like, they're just incredibly pivotal actors, because there's been a couple of cases like that of Chris Weatherhead in the UK, who was sentenced originally 18 months for conspiring for DDoSing. Basically, he wasn't found guilty of DDoSing, but because he ran the chat infrastructure, he was sentenced to 18 months, and he only ended up serving, I think, between 3 to 4 months. But his case was virtually unknown because there wasn't this kind of person running a free Weatherhead campaign. It's really, really important to have people who are there behind the scenes, raising awareness, raising money. And I think in the case of the PayPal 14, these are 14 people who were arrested for their role in DDoSing PayPal in support of WikiLeaks. They got off really light, actually. No jail time, no felonies. Yes, a hugely sort of expensive and difficult legal ordeal, but there was a big kind of campaign in support of them. And it was visible. People were watching. So it's incredibly, incredibly important to kind of have people and groups who can support the either political prisoners once they're jailed, or those that are facing political prison.
Through the legal process itself.
Exactly.
In terms of where things are at now, I'm looking at the sort of levels of repression, particularly in the US, they seem to be more lenient, definitely a lot more lenient in Ireland, and in the UK perhaps as well. Obviously, we have this mushrooming of Anonymous in Peru and kind of different places and different types of manifestations. People like myself that have English as a first language probably aren't aware of a hell of a lot what's going on, right? Where do you see that sort of that type of the activism that was there? Has that been massively disrupted by the sort of the arrests and the repression, or can you see anything that's kind of may replicate itself within sort of where these guys were before?
So it's definitely the case that globally Anonymous is still running really strong, but in the context of much of Western Europe and the United States, the hacking activity, which was on overdrive, is either sporadic or some that has happened has been just more quiet, And there's a tension because, very visible hacking is helpful insofar as you attract supporters and newcomers, right? Hey, we're here, look what we're doing, you're waving this flag. On the other hand, it's just like terrible for security.
Yeah.
And it's much smarter if people are doing this a lot more quietly. And my understanding is that some of the quiet stuff is still happening at kind of a slower pace, more deliberate pace. But there's a tension. There's a tension because, you know, if people stumble upon stuff, like, they do have to get it out there, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, one really good example of a kind of more deliberate, more quiet set of hacking was around Operation Last Resort, which was in support of Aaron Schwartz, who was a young hacker who had committed suicide as he was facing huge legal ordeal and trial simply for downloading journal articles. And, you know, this really hit the hacker community very hard. And so there was a lot of hacking that happened under the aegis of Op Last Resort, but they weren't just on Twitter blasting this away, right? And so basically what I'm trying to say is it's a little bit hard to gauge, you know, it's a little bit hard to gauge. I do think that activity has definitely slowed down, but I don't think it's been eliminated. And I also think the effects of Anonymous are going to, you know, emerge in surprising ways. When WikiLeaks, you know, had been thrown into a bit of a disarray because of the legal battles that Julian Assange faced, some defections. Some people were sort of saying, oh, WikiLeaks is over, and they're insignificant. I was like, oh, are you mad? Like, what they did is going to inspire other people to do the same. And I think, like, Snowden's a perfect example of that. And I think the same thing with Anonymous. You know, what they did that was unusual is that hackers who weren't necessarily part of an organization, so they couldn't just whistleblow from within, they decided to hack to access information. Other people are going to do that already. Other people have already done that. My favorite recent example is with a company called Gamma, which produces surveillance software. And some hacker went in and got the software for Finn Fisher, which has been used by repressive regimes in the Middle East, and he dumped the code, you know? And this is, again, very much in the style of Anonymous. So, yeah, their legacy is going to be with us in very interesting ways, I think, in the future.
Well, just even to wrap it up, and I mean, I really recommend people buy the book because, as I said, it's a really rich and nuanced walk through the growth of Anonymous, I guess, and right up to where we are now. But you kind of, in your conclusion, you kind of talked about your two kind of main things. One was challenging misinformation, which I think you do very, very well. And the other one is embracing enchantment. And you kind of quote or make reference to Block there, and perhaps this idea of a, you know, militant type of optimism. What's that about?
So, you know, sometimes people are debating the minutiae of whether Anonymous is good or bad. You know, like a net good or net gain, or really a destructive anti-democratic force. And it's certainly the case that I can't say every political operation that they've ever done or every tactic I can agree with, right? I really hate it when people's privacy are violated, and I don't mind, like, if a police officer who engaged in pepper spraying is doxxed. I believe that his identity should be splashed all over the place. Should his daughter's identity be splashed all over the place? Absolutely not, you know, and sometimes Anonymous engages in this. Nevertheless, what is really remarkable is I do think that we live in an age where there's a lot of either apathy or cynicism. And people decide not to enter the political arena, either because they're just busy taking care of the little nucleus around them, or they're overworked, or they just don't believe, rightly so, that there's channels available to them for political change, right? It's really tough. And in the end, you know, Anonymous is a space where people decide to take action and do something against all odds. In many ways, and what I mean against all odds is, again, you know, their roots come from a very cynical world of trolling, and, you know, it does kind of take enormous effort to think like one can make a change. It's a little bit idealistic at some level, but it's necessary, you know. And so basically, I think it's very easy to get bogged down by the pessimism of apathy and cynicism. And here is a movement that has spanned the globe, that has had a hand in so many different political movements of the last number of years. And to me, this can only be interpreted as a kind of hopeful sign, you know, one that you kind of want to elevate and embrace in the hopes that you can inspire others to either do something similar or join up, right? We need kind of paradigms and examples where people go, okay, you know, maybe I should, in fact, do something now. And they provide both a useful lesson as to how that came into being, like a political kind of force that was never supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And then also a lot of people were captivated by them. I want to make sure that people continue to be captivated by them, and that was one of the reasons why I decided to write the book in a way that would reinforce that kind of quality of mystery and enchantment that I think that they kind of package so well.
Well, thanks very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Cheers.